in one of those things, the way to solve the deficit is directly tied to the other two things and what you're doing with the other two things. So if there is a deficit in money, I promise you, if you examine how you're spending your time and who you're spending your time with from a connection standpoint, you will solve that money problem.
Hey, everybody, and welcome as usual. And as I always say, I am your intrepid host, endeavoring host, Andrew Dupy. And I have a very exciting guest for us this week. I have with me Michael Roderick. Now, I want to introduce Michael here. Michael began his career as a high school English teacher. So as a fellow former teacher, we already have some connection right off the bat. But that was before he started producing off-Broadway productions and then actually went all the way on to Broadway. This combination of experience in the arts and entrepreneurship led Michael to starting an arts incubator program to teach more artists about building and growing their own business. Eventually, he became dedicated to develop a workshop on networking, which grew into a full-time consulting practice that became Small Pond Enterprises. So Michael took a short break to work as a VP of Ops and Director of Business Development at NYC Education, a tech startup which introduced him to the New York startup community. More recently, Michael is the founder of Connecting Connectors Conference Con. Michael, teacher to Broadway, to entrepreneurship, to coaching. How?
I know,
right?
Simple
question.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I've sort of looked back at sort of the journey and for a very long time when people would ask me sort of how I had moved so quickly and how I would get into all these rooms that were really hard to get into, I almost always kind of defaulted to this idea of, well, it's networking, right? It's about like just building relationships and sort of getting to know people. But when I took a step back a little while back, and I asked myself, if I took networking out of the equation entirely, if I basically said like, okay, what was the reason I got into all the rooms I got into? I had the realization it was because people would talk about me when I wasn't in the room in a good way. And when I realized that so often that's the thing we don't spend nearly enough time on. We don't spend nearly enough time thinking about our level of referability. How do we get others talking about us when we're not in the room? How do we get to that point where everybody wants to introduce us to their friends because they're so fascinated by the things that we said or the things that we shared? So I really dug deep into that, and that's what's led into all of this work around thought leadership that I do today.
Well, then there's the golden question. How in the heck do we get people to start talking good about us when we're not in the room? Because, I mean, I know there's the old saying, you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. So clearly we're going to lead off with that. But what are some tips? What are some strategies that people can have to make that great first impression and make that impression a lasting one?
Yeah. So the problem that happens is that when we think about our expertise and the things that we've spent a lot of time sort of developing, we put an inordinate amount of attention on substance, right? Where we're thinking about like, how do I make this thing kind of the best thing that it can be, and really, come up with like, what are the best concepts and the best ideas, and how do I take this expertise and share it with others? And what we ignore mostly, or what we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, is structure. How do we actually package and structure those ideas so that it is far more likely that those ideas are going to actually be shared and going to be passed along to other people? And most of the time, what ends up happening is we end up in what I like to refer to as the echo chamber of the enlightened, where everybody in our industry is patting us on the back for the terms that we're using and the things that we're saying. But if we go outside of our industry, people don't understand what the heck we're talking about. So we always want to think about, how am I packaging these ideas? How am I structuring these ideas so that any individual could actually carry it and talk about it to somebody else, as opposed to just all of the folks who are like, inside baseball within our within our market or our community.
Yeah, I smiled when you said that because it's so true. When you get into these kind of echo chambers, you get into a small community, you don't think about as much how the jargon and the lingo and the things that you do. If I talk publishing in a room full of people that have nothing to do with publishing, they're going to think I'm speaking Greek.
Yep,
For the most
exactly.
part. So
Exactly.
how do you translate that? How do you
Sure.
find a structure that becomes kind of a universal language in which people can understand?
Yeah, so basically there's three main things that you have to consider, and it's easy to remember because it spells the word aim. So you want to take aim when it comes to this packaging of your ideas. And the first is accessibility. So that's what we just tapped into is you want to think about how do I make this accessible to people completely outside of my industry and outside of my world. And the way that I like to think about this is you want to have an anchor that pretty much everybody gets, everybody understands. So you want to think about what is something that people already recognize and already understand, and then add whatever your innovation is to that particular thing. So you want to think about what is something that everybody already gets. They already understand the concept, they already understand the model, and then you have your innovation. You have your slight variation on the concept. Perfect example is the idea of referable brand, right? Everybody recognizes the idea of a brand and they're like, and we all have our thoughts and sort of, like nobody questions the word brand, right? As something that they can sort of translate or sort of pass around. But when I add this element of referable, it kind of makes you curious as to, well, what does it mean to be a referable brand? So I'm giving you this anchor. I'm giving you this thing that you already recognize, but then I'm adding this innovation to it. And the mistake that I see, I would say 90% of subject matter experts make is that they spend all their time trying to sell their innovation without any kind of anchor. So basically your audience is like, what the heck? Like what does that word mean? Like how does that work? But if you're saying, well, have you ever gone through this or have you ever experienced this? And you talk about something that they've gone through or that they've seen, then they're like, yeah. And then you're like, well, I do that, but for this. And I learned about this when I was in the startup world, right? Because in the startup world, basically what everybody would do was they'd be like, we're the Uber for teacup poodles, and like that was the thing. They take that anchor and then they'd use it. In Hollywood they do that the same thing. It's called log lines for movies.
Right.
So the log line for Alien, the movie Alien, is Jaws but set in space, right? There's your anchor, there's your innovation.
Yeah, because I think you're always thinking about the idea. The term I get is pain points.
Yep.
When you're trying to communicate to somebody, you kind of want to find what is their pain, what thing do you have to answer for them. Like even in a movie, I mean, yes, Jaws in space, or I think I've heard Alien also described as haunted house movie in space.
Yep.
You're immediately going to the pain point of an audience of what they desire to see. They want to see a haunted house movie. They want to get
Yeah.
scared. So
Yep.
how do you be able to identify and find those kind of pain points to be able to
Yeah.
talk to them?
Yeah, so I like to think about this as a target problem. And basically, the way that you want to think about this is if you can describe a target problem so well that the audience is like, that's me or that's my friend, then you're instantly going to get attention, right? You're instantly going to have people be like, oh, yeah. And if you come up with your own phrasing for that target problem, some term that you use, then all of a sudden a bunch of other people are going to use that term, right?
Right.
So let's say, for example, I say most of the folks that I work with suffer from shoemaker's kid syndrome. And then you're like, oh, that's interesting. What is that? Well, they're really great at doing this work for their clients. In some cases, they're even great at actually promoting and sort of like getting the word out about their clients' stuff. But when they try to do it themselves, it just falls apart. Like they don't have that outside perspective helping them sort of figure it out. So even though they can package others and help others and do all of this stuff for others, when it comes to that internal side of things, it's really hard. Just like the whole shoemaker's kid has no shoes idea. right? So what did I do? I created a target problem. I described an issue and I gave it a name, right? And it's like when you have that dynamic, it's like, oh, okay, right? And when you hear that, now it's accessible to you. Now you're like, okay, yes. So what you always want to think about is what is this thing, and your best copy is in your clients' mouths, right? So like if you are talking to your clients and you find the words that they actually use when it comes to these ideas and these concepts, and then you use those same words, all of a sudden folks are going to be like, yep, that's me. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going through. Oh yeah, I'm dealing with that. I've got that particular issue. And that's what creates the level of accessibility, because suddenly they're like, you understand me. And the thing is, the mistake that I see a lot of folks make is that they try to open with the solution. They'll be like, I help such and such group do XYZ, but nobody cares whether or not you help this group and what you help them do if they don't feel like you understand their problem. Just like if you went to a doctor, you'd want them to tell you what you had before they prescribed you what, pills or this type of thing. You'd want them to give you the diagnosis. So that's the thing. Your target problem is a fantastic tool to basically show people that you've created the diagnosis for what they're actually dealing with. And then they want to hear about your target solution. So a target problem gets them to raise their hand, a target solution gets them to open their wallets.
Yeah, I love that, because I see a lot of issues in business where they're too tied up with the results of the problem because the
Yep.
problem has already occurred. And when you come at it, you usually don't identify the problem until until you've actually suffered the consequences.
Yep.
But when you start to actually be able to identify what that problem is, that's really how you stop it from occurring in the future.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And people just trust you more when you've taken the time to really dig into what the actual issue is that they have and given them a definition for it, right? Given them some sort of way of understanding it. And I think that, we often sell transformation, which is sort of the biggest thing that gets sold, but revelation is just as valuable, right? Helping somebody understand a part of themselves, something that they're doing or not doing, is just as valuable as transforming their situation or their process. And in many cases, you need to provide revelation before anybody's going to be willing to pay you for transformation.
So the question that I'm already hearing from some people, I know, but Michael, how do I get in front of people? How do I actually be able to communicate this? Because I have the greatest idea in the world. I have invented the widget and it's a solution for everybody's problem, but nobody knows about it. So
Yep.
what's the step that it takes to get in that room to get people talking?
Yeah, so it's you have to stop thinking about getting in the room or getting in front of somebody, because the way that your brain is thinking in that case is you're thinking about access.
Mhm.
And if you're thinking about access, you're basically trying to sort of bust your way in, right? You're trying to get somebody to give you referrals, you're trying to get people to do things for you, right? What you want to think about is you want to think about interest. How do I create so much interest in what I'm doing that this person basically comes to me, that
Mhm.
they want to learn more from me, that they want to discover things from me? And that's what ties to the second piece, which is influence. So, most of the time when we think about influence, we think about it in the context of persuasion, because that's most of the material that we've been taught, right? We've been taught use these influence techniques to get people to do things. But true influence is when you do something without me asking you to do it.
Yeah.
So, what is the only reason you're going to do something without me asking you? If it gives you something, if it makes you look good. So, most of the time, the mistake that we're making is we're not coming up with something that is going to actually make the other person look better. We're trying to come up with something that makes us look good.
Mhm.
And if we come up with something that makes them look better, they're going to share that with their friends.
Right.
And the way I like to think about this, I call it a magic trick. So if you've ever been to a party, and there's a magician there. Every magician has at least one trick where they can show you exactly how they do the trick. They'll show you how they make the card disappear, how the pencil go up the nose, whatever it is, right? And what's the next thing that most people want to do? They want to go to a party and show people that trick. So what you want to do, if you want to get in those doors, you want to create that interest by having a magic trick, by having something that you've created or that you share that other people go and share with others, because it basically makes them think, right? And it gets them really, really curious. And I will do it right now in real time.
Okay.
So I'm gonna show you a magic trick. And when I tell you this magic trick, I can't tell you the number of times other people have gone and done things with this, and it's referred back to me over and over and over again. Here's the trick. Every single person that you know, doesn't matter what industry they're in, has a TCM index. That is an index of time, connections, and money. Those three things are top concern for every single person that you meet. You right now, as an individual, have different quantities of those three things. I can promise you, for most people, there is at least one where they would like more of it. They either want more time, they want more sort of better connections, or they want more money, right? Now, here's the trick. If there is a deficit in one of those things, the way to solve the deficit is directly tied to the other two things and what you're doing with the other two things. So if there is a deficit in money, I promise you, if you examine how you're spending your time and who you're spending your time with from a connection standpoint, you will solve that money problem. If there is a time problem, if you look at who are you spending time with and how are you spending your money, you will be able to get time back by hiring somebody who can do something that normally takes you 5 hours and it's only going to take them 1, right? There's always something that you can do to sort of make that piece of things happen. And if you're having a connections problem where you're trying to meet certain types of people, I can guarantee it's tied to your time and your money. Because if you're trying to sell some $50,000 product and you're going to free networking seminars, you are not going to do very well when it comes to that. So now think about that. Anybody listening to this, anybody going through this process, if they sat down today and they just wrote out their TCM and they took the time to do a little bit of an observation about that, wouldn't they have the possibility of maybe having some kind of transformation as a result of sort of thinking differently about those three things in their life? Probably. So what does that do? It refers back to me. Anytime somebody talks about TCM, it's going to refer back to this conversation or other conversations. And what's going to happen? People are going to be curious and they're going to want to come to me and ask me, what else do you have? Right? Like, that was a really cool trick. What other tricks do you have? That was so interesting. And if I said to you, I can take TCM and I can take just that simple concept of TCM and I can make it so that you can use that exact same concept and figure out how to create a better claim for your product or service, what have I done? I've created a lot of interest into, like, how do you do that? Like, what is that process? And that's how we get in the rooms. We need to make people curious. I like to think about the Breaking Bad. So a lot of people are very familiar with Breaking Bad.
Yep.
At the very beginning of every episode of Breaking Bad, there is some scene that basically is so confusing because it's completely out of context with everything else that's going on that you have to watch the episode, sometimes all the way through the episode, and sometimes you have to watch multiple episodes to pay off whatever that scene
Yeah.
was. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That you saw at the top. Now, here's a little behind the scenes stuff for you. In the entertainment world, ratings are not counted unless the viewer watches past the midpoint of the show.
Mhm.
So they wrote those episodes to basically bolster those ratings because people would watch it all the way through or watch it because they created curiosity.
Mhm.
And if you want to create interest, the best way to do that is to create curiosity, to basically leave things out and have people say, oh, I need to know more about that. I'm curious about that. And again, if now other people are sharing that and talking about it, it makes people curious. Where did you learn that? Where did you find that out? And then that gets you back. So you don't think about access, you think about interest.
Yeah, that's awesome because you're talking about the way in which you find a type of branding and a
Mm-hmm.
type of branding that just that is like a hook. It brings in people. We've had some of our authors do it, and that's why they write books with us. Tom
Yep.
Fajo, next to Filling, I'll give him a shout out right now with Pam. Everybody wants to know what Pam is. Guess what? It's not a cooking grease. Read the book.
Yep.
You'll find out, and you'll find out exactly what that is. So how much can you integrate social media and books and things like that into having a brand like that you can then begin to kind of sell and build?
Oh, I mean, there's so much you can do. You can use social media to basically test your target problems and see whether or not your audience is actually resonating with that target problem. Like you can come up with 4 or 5 different names for a target problem, write a different post for all of them, and then see which posts get the most traction or the most response. Right? Let's say you're coming up with a magic trick or an idea, you can write out that magic trick or do a short video of that magic trick and again see how your market interacts. The thing that most of us forget is that promotion is not nearly as effective as market research. So if we are basically putting our ideas out there and we're treating it as research instead of as promotion, if we're literally like, okay, let me put this out and see which things land, which things hit, then we're going to come up with much, much better stuff. And we're going to know which things to refine, which things to spend more time on, and which things probably don't belong in the book, right?
Yeah.
Which things probably are not going to be that useful or that interesting to the audience. And that's really these tools, they're market research tools. They're a way for you to understand your market and understand what that market is going to be willing to buy and understand what that market's pain points are.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about just promoting and sharing and being like, hey, everybody, look at my stuff. It's about here's this idea that I have. How many of you get this idea? Because the biggest thing is that there is a razor thin line between compelling and confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be on the side of compelling. Like you have to be on the side where people are curious and they're interested and they're leaning forward in their seats. And the only way you're going to know whether or not you've gotten to the point of it being compelling or confusing is how does your audience actually interact with it? If they're
Right.
confused, they're not going to really react at all. But if they're compelled, they're going to ask you questions. They're going to dig deeper. They're going to be like, I need to know more about this.
Yeah. Another film analogy, J.J. Abrams, he calls it the mystery box.
Yep.
You want something that there is a constant mystery you want to continue to learn about. And that's, I think, one of the secrets that we have. That's our magic trick with books, is that when we have someone come to us and say, well, I want to put together a book in which I'm going to brand myself, we tell them, don't give it all away.
Yep.
Make sure that when you write that book that there is something that's still bringing that person along to begin to interact with you. We do something similar with the podcast, things like that, where you want to have people get in and interact in the comments or back and forth. That's really how you get in the rooms, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. 100%. You get that level of interest where people are basically like they either want to introduce you to others or they feel like they're just not hearing this type of thing anywhere else. You get invited. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times where I've just shared a target problem or an idea or a concept or a framework that I have with somebody and I have no idea that they have a podcast even, right? And they're just like, you need to be on my podcast, right? And they'll just like go, and I've had numerous instances where those types of things happen because of that creation of interest. And that's where you want to be. You want to get to the point where basically people are like, I need to hear more of whatever it is that you're saying. And that goes back to this idea of the structure, right? You're thinking about, how am I packaging this and how am I making this so that there is heightened levels of curiosity that happen whenever people hear these things that I'm sharing. What am I making sure that I leave out? And I think that this ties really, really important to anything cold outreach oriented. So a lot of people are doing cold outreach, and the mistake that they always make in cold outreach is they give too much, where they're like, here's my offer, here's what I can do for you, here's it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's easy for the person to say yes or no and just kind of go on their way or completely ignore it. But if you leave stuff out, where you're just like, yeah, I found that there was this really, really interesting study that ties food preparation to the writing of books. I'd be happy to share it with you. All of a sudden, it's like you get that response where they're like, what? Food prep and books? How does that work? Right. And that's always the thing. You got to look at whatever you've created. You've got to ask yourself, what do I take out? And then what do I share with people so that there's that gap, just like that Breaking Bad scene, right? Where it's like, can I share this thing that causes them to be like, I need to watch, I need to learn more, I need to figure this out in order to satisfy that craving of getting the answer, right? Our brains are obsessed with these gaps in understanding. So if you create the gap in understanding, people are like, I need to meet you. I need to spend more time with you. And that's how you get in rooms. The second that somebody's like, you are fascinating and my friends need to know you, the second you reach the point where people feel like it is an honor to introduce you to someone else because you make them look cool, you will get into any room that you want to get into.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's like, I think someone described a human being as a pattern seeking missile.
Yeah.
Now, Lincoln described me as the camera seeking missile, but it's the same general concept that, yeah, you always want to fill in those patterns. Well, Michael, as we kind of start wrapping up a little bit here,
Yeah,
I always kind of want to leave off with something that we haven't really touched on, something that you feel is
sure.
universally applicable. You've all honestly given us a lot of really practical advice already in this
Yeah.
episode. But what is something that we just haven't touched on that all of our audience can listen to right now, and maybe another magic trick, or maybe the lead into
Sure.
another magic trick, something they can do?
Yeah. So I'll go with the last piece because it's accessibility, influence, and memory. So
Sure.
I will give you the tools that you can use to basically make anything that you have way more memorable. Okay. So the easiest way to make it so that people remember you more is to focus on less, which is language, emotion, simplicity, and structure.
Hmm.
So I'll start with language. If you have your own language for things, you will basically carve a piece of mental real estate for individuals because we look at words and we associate those words with certain brands and certain ideas. So if I say the word venti, there is no question which coffee company I'm referring to,
Mm-hmm.
right? So with your own content, think about the language. Always ask yourself, do I have my own name for this? Do I have my own way of describing this? Because if you do, it's going to stick in people's memory more and it's going to really catch their attention. The second is emotion. Emotion solidifies memory. Whenever we are emotionally aroused, what happens in our brains is our brain becomes like a sponge and
Mm-hmm.
we absorb way more details. And going back to the movie idea, the example that I always give is ask anybody what the opening scenes in the film Titanic are, and very few people have any kind of, very specific answer. But ask anybody which image comes into their head when I say I'll never let go, and everybody knows exactly what that scene is because they have that emotional connection to it. So anytime you're thinking about how do I make it so that this thing will be remembered, think about what are the emotions that I'm tapping into? What am I making people feel when I'm describing something so that they have that moment of, oh yes, I remember that. and they might recall their own experiences of that emotion and sort of that side of things. Simplicity has to do with the fact that our brains can only hold so much information at any one time. And the problem is, all throughout our lives, academics have rewarded complexity. So we were rewarded in school for writing the biggest papers and using the biggest words. But when you get out into the real world, the memory rewards simplicity.
Yep.
The simpler it is, the easier it is to actually carry in the brain. So you always want to ask yourself, how do I boil this thing down and make it really, really simple for people to carry? Because if there's too many points, if there's too many things, going back to what we talked about with influence, people won't share something if they feel it looks awkward or they feel they can't remember it all. Mm-hmm. Right? So you want to have something that's so succinct where it's like, oh, yep, it's this, this, and this. Right? That's why TCM works so well. Right? Because it's very, very simple to describe. It's very, very simple to implement sort of right away. Right? And then the last piece is structure, because our brains need order in order to process information. So if you give something a structure, people are able to remember it easier. They'll have a packaging for it. They're like, I know that this comes first, this comes second, this comes third. Accessibility, influence, and memory spells the word aim. That's a structure, right? But it's also a structure if you actually pay attention to it chronologically, because you've got to start with accessibility. If you don't have accessibility, you don't have anything. Then you got to get to this level of influence and start thinking about how I'm going to package this and what I'm going to put together. But both of those things don't matter unless somebody can remember it. So you got to layer on the memory. Otherwise, all that work you did in accessibility and influence isn't going to matter at all.
Yep.
Right? So that follows a logical progression, so it makes it easier for somebody to remember. So if you focus on language, emotion, simplicity, and structure, get people to remember more by focusing on less, you're going to have things that they're sticking in their head like a Taylor Swift song.
That is absolutely awesome. And it makes so much sense. I mean, it really does. Well, Michael, you've given us enough that I'm sure our audience is interested to learn more about you. So how can they do that?
Yeah. So they can go to myreferabilityrater.com if they want to learn more about their own referability. And basically you can do like a little test and it'll show you sort of how referable you are. It'll look at this accessibility, influence, and memory, like all these different points, and they can check that out. And then I'm also at smallpondenterprises.com, and you can find me on all the socials and all the fun places over there. And just feel free to say hello. I'm happy to help.
Fantastic. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, those links are down below. Michael, it was a pleasure. We could go on for hours on this.
I know.
But yeah, I really enjoyed having you on today.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Great. Fantastic. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.